We're learning the third Sicha on Parshas Boy in Chelek Chaf Aleph on page 68. The shir today is being learned L'Nei Nishmas Rabbi Yosef ben Yamin ben Rabbi Menashe Kaltman. Wegen der Mitzvah von Sippur b'Yitzias Mitzrayim b'Leil Pesach. Regarding the mitzvah of telling the story of the Exodus of Yidden going out of Mitzrayim on the night of Pesach. Zok the Rambam writes as follows. Mitzvah saseh shel Torah l'saper b'nisim v'neflois shenasa la v'seinu b'Mitzrayim. It's a positive commandment to tell the story of the miracles and wonders that Hashem performed for our ancestors in Mitzrayim. B'leil chamish asa b'nisim, on the night of the 15th of Nisan, the night of Pesach. Shenema, as the pasuk says, Zocher es hayom hazeh asher yitzasem in Mitzrayim. Remember this day that you went out of Mitzrayim. Kamay shenemar, and this is similar to what the pasuk says regarding Shabbos. Zocher es hayom HaShabbos. Remember the day of Shabbos. Stellen sich mefarshei Rambam. So the commentaries on the Rambam ask the following questions. Aleph, number one, was meint der Rambam mit Kamay shenemar Zocher es hayom HaShabbos? What is the comparison that the Rambam is saying here that remembering Yitzias Mitzrayim on Pesach is compared to the mitzvah of Kiddush, of remembering Shabbos? Was ist nicht maspik in dem Tzivui Zocher es hayom hazeh? What is not understood in the command where it says, remember this day of Yitzias Mitzrayim, was das Lernen haraus von dem Vergleich mit Zocher es hayom HaShabbos. And therefore there's something that we're learning out from Shabbos, from the pasuk of Zocher es hayom HaShabbos. On Beis, the second question, Oibim muss ja ankommen zu dem Vergleich mit Schire by Shabbos. If there's something that we have to learn out from the remembrance that it says regarding Shabbos, who is the makar of them? Where is the source for what the Rambam says here? Okay, so the Rebbe begins with showing what the Rambam himself says in Sefer HaMitzvahs. In Sefer HaMitzvahs bringt the Rambam. In the Sefer HaMitzvahs, when the Rambam talks about this mitzvah, he brings the following sources. What it says in the Mechilte is Miklal shenemar ki yisholcha bincha. When it says in the pasuk regarding telling the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim that if your son will ask a question and then you answer him and explain him what Yitzias Mitzrayim is all about. So Yochel, I would think, Im yisholcha bincha atamagad leichola. Only if you have a son and he's asking you a question, then you have the mitzvah to tell him the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim. But if not, the mitzvah doesn't apply. Talmud Laima, therefore, it says in another place, V'higada tolavincha, that you should take the initiative and share and tell your son, even if he's not asking you. Further, the Mechilta says, I would think that this only applies if you have a son. If you're yourself, or you're with someone else, not your son. From where do I know that you have the mitzvah of telling the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim? Talmud Laimar, so the pasuk says, "Vayem Moshe la'am Zocher es hayom hazeh." Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Yidden, remember this day that you went out of Mitzrayim, including if you're yourself or even with someone else, not with your son. And the Rambam is Meisef, and there in Sefer HaMitzvahs, the Rambam goes on and adds, Reitze Laimar. What this pasuk means to say is, Shehutziva lezachroi k'Moshe Ama Zocher es hayom HaShabbos. There's a mitzvah to remember the day of Yitzias Mitzrayim, just like you have to remember the day of Shabbos. So now, what do we understand from this Rambam? What is the comparison to Zocher es hayom HaShabbos? To say is that from pasuk Zocher es hayom hazeh yitzasem in Mitzrayim learn penop. From this pasuk we learn out as mitzvah schiras yitzias Mitzrayim is da oich beinay leben atzmai. This is the source that the mitzvah to remember and tell the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim is even when you're alone. Afilemes is nitah kem ben ashel, when you don't have a son that's asking you a question. Und the Ruf is the Rambam Meisef al Tzechache, and the Rambam here adds and brings the proof for this, that what is meant with this is that you should remember, just like you remember on Shabbos. The mitzvah of remembering Shabbos, which is the mitzvah of making Kiddush, is even when you're yourself. Is by Same here, telling the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim is even when you are alone. So if so, we can say that this is the pshat in the Rambam here, in the Sefer Hayad, when the Rambam brings the comparison to Shabbos. So So it would seem that the pshat here is, as das is euch kavanasa in Sefer Hayad, and then was a vergleich the mitzvah Zachras Yom Hazeh to Zachras Yom HaShabbos, as is mechuyev euch b'nei lebenatzmai. It's the same point here. The Rambam is comparing the mitzvah of telling the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim to the mitzvah of remembering Shabbos regarding this point, that you have to say it even when you're alone. This is l'chayra euch mashma von hemshach haloshen. And it seems to be the case that this is the point here from what the Rambam says later. How do you know that the mitzvah is on the night of Pesach? That it's on that day when you have the matzah and mother in front of you. Then the Rambam goes on to say, and this mitzvah is even if you don't have a son, and even a wise person that knows it all, nevertheless has the mitzvah to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Was bepashtus meint es? Simply, the Rambam is saying here, as the Makar of Din, the source for what he says here, that the mitzvah includes even if you don't have a son, if sind dem frier gebrachten Pasuk, Zachras Yom Hazeh, wo es wird nicht der Mond ben the Chadayme. The source is from the Pasuk that was quoted, where it says you should remember this day, and it doesn't say anything about a son. Therefore, it's understood that the mitzvah applies even when you don't have a son. That's the point of the comparison to Zocher es Yom HaShabbos, as it says it in the Sefer HaMitzvahs. However, the Rebbe does not accept this pshat for what the Rambam is saying here in Sefer Hayad. Es ist aber schwer sagen, als das ist der ganze Tam, was der Rambam is meisiv, k'meshenem es Zocher es Yom HaShabbos. However, it's difficult to say that it's only this that is the point that the Rambam adds the comparison to Shabbos. Warum? Von dem Lashon von dem Pasuk Gufe. Zocher es Yom Hazeh sheyitzasem mitzrayim. Because if you look at the language of this pasuk itself, that the Rambam quotes as the source of the mitzvah, where it says you should remember this day that you left Mitzrayim, ukanal as vibalt as vert nit amon ben unafil nit acherim. In this pasuk, it doesn't mention anything of a son or anyone else. It's verstandig, so it's self-understood as the chiyuv aschire is eich ben lebenatzmai, that the obligation to remember and say the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim is even when you're alone. As you can see in the Mechilta itself, as dort brengt sich nicht the pasuk Zachar es Yom HaShabbos. The Mechilta asks, from where do we know that you have that mitzvah when you're alone? And it just brings the pasuk Zachar es Yom Hazeh, and it does not mention the comparison to Shabbos. So the Rambam, why would he have to bring that comparison to Zachar es Yom HaShabbos in order to prove that the mitzvah applies even when you're alone? So now why in Sefer HaMitzvahs does the Rambam go on and compare it to Zachar es Yom HaShabbos as a proof? So Bishleim Sefer HaMitzvahs, in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, it's understood why the Rambam does that. We can understand why he has to compare to the mitzvah of Zachar es Yom HaShabbos. Hayes, as the limud aschira the Yetzias Mitzrayim from Zachar v'goyme, because when the Rambam brings the source of the pasuk Zachar es Yom Hazeh, kumt al tzeisafe, it's only coming as an added source after we see the first and main source for the mitzvah. Where's the beginning, or what's the primary source of the mitzvah of telling the story on the night of Pesach? And on the Mechilta was bringt, and also in the Mechilta that the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs quotes, the source is in the pasuk where it speaks about a son asking or telling the story to his son. So if that's the primary source, the way the Rambam quotes it in Sefer HaMitzvahs, darf the Rebbe bavarnen as the pasuk Zachar es Yom Hazeh main schire. So now, afterwards, when we bring the pasuk where it says, remember this day, that this means to remember and tell the story. So this pasuk, was is nit verbunden mit ki yishalcha bincha v'gad televincha, and that pasuk of Zachar es Yom Hazeh is not based on, and it's not a follow-up to what it says, ki yishalcha bincha v'gad televincha, nor wie bei Schire Shabbos as euch b'nei lebenatzmai is da the chiyuv mitzvah Schire Yetzias Mitzrayim. But rather it's similar to Shabbos, where you have the mitzvah to remember Shabbos even when you are alone. So it's only a Sefer HaMitzvah where he quotes the other psukim as the primary source that it's necessary to clarify that Zachar es Yom Hazeh is not a pasuk that continues the theme of the other psukim. Rather, it's a pasuk for itself, which is a source that you're obligated in the mitzvah alone. Aber in Sefer Hayad, however, in the Rambam, in the Sefer Hayad, wo the limud from pasuk Zachar es Yom Hazeh is the einzige Makerles la'achil from Sipur B'Yetzias Mitzrayim. This is the only source that the Rambam brings as a source for the obligation to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim. Meichet teiset zu lernen, as the pasuk meint leben davke. Why would I think that this pasuk that is is a mitzvah only when you have a son. Und soll der Vater davon bringen, nach Heichache von Schire Shabbos, as das meint euch, ben Oile ben Atzmai. And therefore it's necessary to prove that, no, it refers even to when one is alone. He doesn't quote here the other psukim where it says, Ki yisholcha bilcho v'yigada levincha. So it's clear that this is a mitzvah that's in all situations, even when you're alone. So therefore our original question comes back, why is the Rambam comparing Zachar Yom Hazeh to Zachar Yom Shabbos? So the Rabbi offers another explanation. The Migdal Lois brengt Lashon Mechilta now. The Migdal Lois, one of the commentaries in the Rambam, also quotes what the Mechilta says. Und es danach Messiah, and he concludes as follows. V'kosav Ramzal b'Sefer HaMitzvah Shalai. The Rambam writes in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, Shu tziva b'zchirosei b'zmanoi, that this is a mitzvah that Hashem commands to remember and tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim in its time, meaning when it happened on the night of Pesach. Hashem commands to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim. How do we know that it's in the time that it happened? Similar to what it says regarding Shabbos, that you remember the day of Shabbos when? On the day of Shabbos itself. So to here the mitzvah of Zachas Yom Hazeh refers to remembering on the day of Shabbos itself. That's the pshat in the Sefer HaMitzvahs that the Migdal Ois says. So based on this, we can say that the same is true here with what the Rambam says in the Sefer HaYad. The Rambam learned from pasuk Zachar Yom Hazeh Asher Yitzasem Mitzrayim. From this pasuk, the Rambam learns As da a mitzvah asem yechedes lesape b'Yetzias Mitzrayim in den Tag, when this is vorgekommen, to say the story on the day, on the night of Pesach, Leil Tezvav, that when it happened. This is in addition to the obligation to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim all year. That's learned from a different pasuk. From Laman Tiskar Yem Tzeischa Meretz Mitzrayim Kol Yemei Chayecha, that you have to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim every day of your life. Now, how does the Rambam know that this pasuk is a source for a special mitzvah on the night of Yetzias Mitzrayim? Und if then bringt der Hechachik, Moshe Nema, Zachas Yom Shabbos, was dorten is this Chire b'Yom Zeh Atzmai. That just like by Shabbos, the mitzvah of Zachas Yom Shabbos is on Shabbos itself, so too here, the mitzvah is a mitzvah on the night of Pesach itself. Und nachdem is the Rambam Mamshech, and the Rambam continues and says, from where do we know that the mitzvah is the night of the 15th, the night of Pesach? So now, based on the pshat that we're saying here, that according to the Rambam, we know that it's on the night of Pesach because we're comparing to Shabbos, that the mitzvah is to remember at the time and the night when it happened. So why does the Rambam go on and ask the question, from where do we know B'leil Chamish Asa? We just brought the source. So according to this pshat, we can explain. Because if the source was only from this pasuk of Zachas Yom Hazeh that we compared to Shabbos, that it has to be on the night of Pesach, as the mitzvah is that the mitzvah is as soon as the Yontiv enters, or the Garme Boid Yom, or that could be even when it's still day, even before it's night, or even before it's completely night, similar to the way it is by Shabbos. If one accepts Shabbos earlier on, when it's still day, so then he can make Kiddush then. So maybe you would think that the mitzvah of telling the stories, Zachar Yom Hazeh, would include even earlier on, before it's dark. The Rebbe is a mamshach and brings the pasuk, so the Rambam goes on and clarifies and brings an additional pasuk. V'gada to levincha b'yema hu leimar bavuzeh b'shor sheyesh matzeh u'morer menachem lefanecha. That when it says in the pasuk bavuzeh, it refers to the time when you have the matzeh u'morer in front of you, and that's only at night. As the chiyuv v'hagada is b'leil chamishasa, that the obligation of saying the story of Pesach of Yetzias Mitzrayim and the Haggadah is only at the night after Tzeisak Yechavim when it's dark outside. That would be a pshat in the Rambam. What's the comparison to Shabbos? Das ist aber nicht maspik. However, this pshat is also insufficient. Warum lefizeh? Because according to this, is noisef of them in additional to the following problem here. As the hechlich by Shabbos, as the schire dav zayin b'yom Shabbos atzmai. In the pasuk where it says Zachar Yom Shabbos, how do we know that that pasuk is actually speaking about remembering Shabbos, making kiddush on Shabbos itself? Is l'chayre from vart lekatchay. It's from the word that it says lekatchay, to sanctify it on this day. V'shteit noch Zachar Yom Shabbos. That word that says after the words of Zachar Yom Shabbos, that you're sanctifying this time, this day. Is oib nor das volt gewen kavanas Rambam. So if this alone is the point of the Rambam, to prove that the mitzvah is on the day or on the night when Yidden went out of Mitzrayim, wollte doch euch gedacht meitig sein, then wort lekatshe. So then the Rambam should have to quote the word lekatshe, which is the source for this point. That's one problem here. In addition, is nit move on. The main question on this pshat is, oib if uplernen die mitzvah say miyuchedes, if it's to teach us this unique mitzvah that we have, in addition to the entire year, also this night of Pesach to tell the story, hat der Rambam bechlal nit gedav bringen dem limud shenema zachas yem hazeh sheitzasem mitzrayim. It's not necessary at all to bring the source from this pasuk of zachas yem hazeh. On the far darfen meisav sein die achache kemoi shenema zachas yem Shabbos. And then, in order to clarify and prove that ayem hazeh actually refers to a mitzvah on the day when it happened, to compare then to what it says zachas yem Shabbos. Dem Pasik, für wann man lernt der Reis, dem Chiev und dem Zman von El Chamisha Oster benissen, bringt doch gleich lachrise. Wie garet levin chabayayma hu lema bavuzeh. It's enough to bring the Pasik where we see this clearly, where it says that it's on that day, bavur zeh, when you have the matzah mother in front of you after Tzeisek Yechavim, when it's dark. That alone is a perfect source that there's a unique mitzvah to tell the story now, B'leil Pesach. So why is it at all, according to this, necessary to bring the previous pasuk of Zachas Yem Hazeh and then compare it to Shabbos? So therefore the Rebbe offers here a new original answer, and the Rebbe begins with first pointing out the source from where the Rambam took this comparison from, and there in that source we can see what the idea is that's being learned out from the comparison to Shabbos. Therefore it seems to say as follows. As the Mokke divrei Rambam is from Shmois Rabbah b'Parsha Seinu. The source of the Rambam is in the Medrash in Shmois Rabbah in this week's Parsha. The anderen Mefarshim sagen, as other commentaries point out, was dort gleich ben zu die Zechire die Yetzias Mitzrayim zu die Zechire de Shabbos. In this Medrash it compares remembering the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim to remembering Shabbos. V'zel Sheinoi, this is what the Medrash says. Hazer li Yisrael, you should tell Yidden that Kishem Shubarasi Yisraelam, just like I created this world. And I told Yidden to remember the day of Shabbos, to commemorate Hashem creating the world. Shenemar Zachas Yom Shabbos, and that's the mitzvah to remember the day of Shabbos. So to remember the miracles that I performed for you when you were in Mitzrayim. And remember the day that you left Mitzrayim. Remember this day that you came out of Mitzrayim. So here we see that the Medrash says that this is the way the mitzvah was taught to Yidden. That Yidden are warned and told that just like you remember the day that Hashem rested from creating the world, and that's the day of Shabbos, similarly you should remember the miracles that Hashem performed to take you out of Mitzrayim. So we have here a clear source, like the Rambam says. But the question though is, the Sefer Hayad is doch a Sefer v'zaininin is halachas. The Rambam brings anything that's relevant for actual halacha. Und nicht stam meitig sein droshes Chazal. He doesn't just bring various ideas that Chazal expound and the understanding of psukim and comparisons and anything of that sort. So the question here is, was is the halacha in Sippur B'Yetzias Mitzrayim, welchem lernt up von der Ashva now? What actual halacha do we learn from this comparison, Shabbos being compared, or Yetzias Mitzrayim rather, being compared to Shabbos? The Bir Bezeh, so the explanation here is as follows. In der halacha, wegen des Chiris Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Rambam here is introducing the unique mitzvah that there is to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim. Is Kavanasa shel Rambam zum Mefader sein. It's the intention of the Rambam to clarify and explain dem Shinui betoichen achiev from the mitzvah Schiris Yetzias Mitzrayim beleil tezvav nissen legabe mitzvasa agans yar. What is the difference in the Bir Bezeh? So the explanation for why the Rambam brings this comparison, this drasha, is in the halacha wegen Schiris Yetzias Mitzrayim. In this halacha, where the Rambam introduces the unique mitzvah of remembering Yetzias Mitzrayim on this night of Pesach, is kavanaseh shel Rambam zum Mefarish sein. It's the Rambam's intention to clarify for us dem Shinui betoichen achiyuv von der mitzvahs Schiris Yetzias Mitzrayim beleil tezvav nissen legabe mitzvasa agans yar. What's unique, what's different in the content of this obligation of remembering Yetzias Mitzrayim on the night of Pesach in contrast to the rest of the year? Why is there a new mitzvah here? We're anyways obligated to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim every day of the year. The Haisafe in the mitzvah, Beleil Chamisha Asa Benissen, what's added here in this mitzvah to remember Yitzias Mitzrayim on the night of Pesach is nit nor in them. It's not only the fact, was B'chol HaShana is the mitzvah Lahaskir Yitzias Mitzrayim. All year the mitzvah is to remember, to mention the fact that we left Mitzrayim. This is Genuk Aschir Ba'alma, just a commemoration. Und B'tezvav Nissen is the mitzvah Lesaper, Ba'arichas Chulu. On this night of Pesach, the mitzvah is to tell a story and to tell it with all its length and all its details. That's one difference, but it's not only this. There's a difference here in the content and the essence of what the mitzvah has, what it is that we're focusing on to remember in the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim. In all days of the year is maspik lahaskir Yitzias Mitzrayim. It's enough to remember just the fact that we left Mitzrayim. To remember the fact that Yidden went out from the subjugation of Mitzrayim. Aber Beleil Pesach is the mitzvah nit nur die Yitzias Mitzrayim. On the night of Pesach, the mitzvah is not only to remember going out of Mitzrayim, nor lesaper, as the Rambam says, to tell the story that benissim v'neflois chulu, the miracles and wonders. The nissim v'neflois was the Rebishter had getan areisnam the Yidden from Mitzrayim. The miracles and wonders that Hashem performed, taking Yidden out of Mitzrayim. That's the additional focus that there is in the mitzvah to remember Yitzias Mitzrayim on the night of Pesach. And thus, it's this additional detail, which is the main focus here in the mitzvah, lernt man up from the Hashvos to Zocher es Yom HaShabbos. We learn from the comparison to Shabbos. In Pasuk, Zocher es Yom Hazeh sheyitzasem Mitzrayim, in this Pasuk itself, where it says, remember this day that you left Mitzrayim, is nit meforish und mudgish, as in the Schire Beleil Pesach, dav zayin de lesape benisim v'nes flois cholo. It's not clear and it's not emphasized that the mitzvah of remembering Yitzias Mitzrayim on the night of Pesach includes, or is also primarily, to remember the miracles and wonders that Hashem performed for Yidden then. So therefore the Rambam clarifies as the Zachir Da is K'may Shenem as Zachar Siyam Shabbos, that we learn out and we understand the content of the mitzvah here, like what it says by Shabbos. So what do we learn from there? Shabbos is Zeicher L'Maisa Bereishis. Remembering Shabbos is remembering that Hashem created the world. That on 6 days Hashem created the world. And as we see it in the language of the Medrash, which is the source of the Rambam, just like Shabbos is to rest on the day that Hashem rested from creating the world, to remember the creation that Hashem created, so too, as the Medrash emphasizes, you should remember not just leaving Mitzrayim, but the miracles that Hashem performed for Yidden to go out of Mitzrayim. That's the comparison to Shabbos. And therefore it's a different content. The obligation of the mitzvah has a different content, not just to remember Yitzias Mitzrayim, but the miracles and wonders that Hashem performed for Yidden. Now, to take this a step deeper, on a deeper level, we can explain the comparison to Shabbos as follows. As the Ashvot zu Zocher es Yom Shabbos, comparing the mitzvah of Yitzias Mitzrayim, of remembering Yitzias Mitzrayim, to Shabbos, is nit nor a mokir of dem chiyuv l'saper b'nisim v'neflois chulu. It's not only a source for the obligation that you have to remember also the miracles and wonders, norecha agdome zu divaitige halachis and empedic. But it's also an introduction to halachis that the Rambam says further on in the Pedic, which gives us a different picture of the understanding of what the mitzvah of remembering Yitzias Mitzrayim on this night is all about. And to explain this, let's first understand better what is unique about the mitzvah of remembering Shabbos. Divrei Rambam and Nonei Bilchas Shabbos. So what does the Rambam say right at the beginning of Hilchas Shabbos? Shvise b'shvi mimalacha mitzvah saseh. To rest on the 7th day of the week from work is a positive commandment. Shenemar avayim hashvi tishbais. On the 7th day you rest. And v'chol ha'isa by malacha, anyone that does any work on Shabbos, bittul mitzvah saseh, you have nullified, you have transgressed on the mitzvah saseh, v'ovar aloi sesachulu. And also you have transgressed on a negative commandment that leisasa malacha, not to do work on Shabbos. So what do we see here from the way that Rambam opens up the halachas of Shabbos? This means, as by Shabbos and Dot Tzvei Inyanim. In Shabbos, there are two different aspects. Sai and Inyan the Shlila. There's one in the negative, Loisese, Issa Malacha, the negative commandment, to refrain from work. Sai and Inyan the Chiyuv. But then there's also something in the positive, Asay. a positive of what you are actively doing, sort of, which is Shayvizain. Meaning, the idea of resting, there's a positive aspect to the resting. It's not just the lack or the refraining from work. Then was the Rambam hyped on Hilchos Shabbos mit der Mitzvah Saseh. Now, how does the Rambam begin? He begins first with the positive commandment. Af al pi as rubam kekulam von Hilchos Shabbos. Zenen in einem Inyan von ihrem Mitzvahs Loisase. Most of the halachas of Hilchos Shabbos are all in relation to the Loisase. In the Prati HaMalachis and all of the details of the Malachis, the Lamed Tes Avos Malachis v'Tol the same Chulu, the 39 Malachis and all of the branches of them, the offsprings of them, that's the main details that the Rambam focuses on. But nevertheless, he starts with the positive commandment that the Mitzvah Saseh is moving. It's understood as the Ikke for Shmira Shabbos is nit der Inyan ahead of from Malacha. The main point about Shabbos is not the lack or negating work, nor the Inyan Chiyuvi, rather the positive. Ha'aseh menucha v'loy bitl Malacha. The mitzvah, the main focus of Shabbos is the positive, the fact that it's a day of rest, and not only the fact that you're refraining from work. This is a quote from the Rogatchover. And there's actually a relevance, a difference, la halacha, what the main focus of Shabbos is, whether it's just the lack of work, refraining, or the positive being in a condition of rest. The Rogatchover isn't them as the Rogatchover explains this. That's what we see in the Rambam regarding Shabbos. Now, to explain this better, we can say, as the tzvei inyanim, der inyan shlili v'inyan chiyuvi sheb'Shabbos, the negative aspect of Shabbos, and the positive aspect in Shabbos, kommen from the tzvei parshiyos and psukim v'shteim by Shabbos. They come from the two places in Torah where it mentions in the psukim the mitzvah of keeping Shabbos. Aleph b'maisa Bereshis. One is in Parshas Bereshis, where in the end of creation, where it says, Vayishbeis b'yom hashvi mekom malachtai, Hashem rested on the seventh day from all his work. He blessed this day and sanctified this day. This is the day that he rested from all his work. Which is what aspect of Shabbos? Das was in dem Tag is given, die Shvise v'heder hamalacha. It's on this day that Hashem stopped and refrained from the work that was done on all the other 6 days. That's one aspect of Shabbos that we see in Parshas Bereshis. By Matan Torah, then there's the mitzvah of keeping Shabbos as it's in Matan Torah. After the pasuk says Zachar Yom Shabbos, the pasuk goes on to explain Hashem created the world 6 days, and he rested on the seventh. Hashem blessed this day and he sanctified this day. So over here, what's the pasuk highlighting? The Eisgeteiltkeit von Shabbos, what's unique about this day of Shabbos is nicht nur damit, was damals hat sich geendigt in Maise Bereshis. It's not the fact that this was the completion of the work of the other 6 days, the Sheshis Yomim, Masa Avaye, and Vayishbeis Bekom Malachto, and now Hashem is stopping that work, nor Nochmer, but rather what the pasuk is highlighting is Vayonach Bayoyim Hashvi. It's this day that's the day of rest. That's the idea of Shabbos that's we're focusing on in the mitzvah of Shabbos that it says in the Aseres HaDibros by Matan Torah. Und behesem lezeh is euch der Oiftu von Zachros Yom Shabbos, die Zechire von Shabbos. And in relation to what it speaks about in the Aseres HaDibros, this is what the pasuk of Zachros Yom Shabbos is mainly focused on. Gidrav and Yana is that Inyan Chiyuvi from Shabbos. The mitzvah of Zachros Yom Shabbos, the mitzvah of making Kiddush on Shabbos, the main point of this mitzvah is the positive aspect of Shabbos. Nicht nur der Mannen, das was der Tag ist anders von the andere Tag, der mit, was is Mushlo von Malacha. It's not only about remembering and saying that this day is different, and the fact that we refrain from work, that you don't do the work like the other days. Nur euch mit dem, was hatten sich ein Inyan Chiyuvi, but also with the fact that this day of Shabbos has something positive to itself. Vayonach Bayom Hashvi, a day of rest on the seventh day. U'kamayim Razal, and as it says also in the Medrash, as Rashi brings this, as Haya Olam Chaser Manucha, the world was lacking peace and rest. Bas Shabbos, Bas Manucha. The day of Shabbos is a day of rest. Und das direkt sich heißt in Schira Shabbos, and this is expressed in the way that Rambam describes the mitzvah of remembering Shabbos, the mitzvah of Kiddush. Ubelashna Rambam Zachreyu Zechiras Shvach v'Kiddush. Remember Shabbos with praise and to sanctify the day. Meaning we're not focusing on the negative, that it's a day that's different than the other 6 days, that we refrain from work, but rather the positive, the praise and the holiness of Shabbos. That's the aspect of Shabbos in the pasuk of Zocher es Yom HaShabbos. So based on this we could say, as das is euch kavanas Rambam mit der Shvav and Schiris Yitzias Mitzrayim to Schire de Shabbos. This is also what the Rambam means when he compares the mitzvah of remembering the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim to the mitzvah of remembering Shabbos. As euch in dem Sibbe Yitzias Mitzrayim is der Ikke the Inyan Chayuv Shabai. Also regarding telling the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim, the main point to focus on the night of Pesach is the positive aspect of Yitzias Mitzrayim. So here as well, there are 2 aspects to the Yidden leaving Mitzrayim. So the explanation for this is, by Yitzias Mitzrayim haben sich bei the Bnei Yisrael aufgetan 2 Sachen. When Yidden left Mitzrayim, there were 2 things that happened. Aleph, number 1, Bittel v'Yitzia von Shibud in Reshus Mitzrayim, to nullify and to leave the slavery of being under the jurisdiction of Mitzrayim. Beis, the other point is, das was is dann geworden, Bnei Chayren b'Reshus Atzmam. Then the new identity that Yidden attained, that they became free people, and they are in their own possession. They were elevated to a different status of being Bnei Chayren. The positive point. Ubedugmi das is by the Yitzia v'Shichur for Yedin Evet. Similar to the way this is when a slave is freed and is let to go from his master. Aleph, the bittul hashibud v'nadin. The first point is to nullify the slavery that his master owns him. Evet nifka mireshusay ubalusay. That he's removed, and the ownership and the possession of the master stops and is over. That's one point. But it doesn't necessarily mean that he has gained his own status of freedom, that he's in his own possession. Beis, das was is keine atzmai als ben chayren. And then the fact that he attains his own freedom, that he gets elevated to the status of being a free person. Zwei legamri basundere inyanim. These are 2 completely different steps and different points. As we find this, that it's divided in 2 different time periods when it comes to a slave leaving in the year of Yovel. These 2 points are accomplished in 2 different times in the beginning of Yovel. As the Rambam says, from Rosh Hashanah until Yom Kippur, so the slaves cannot yet go back home, but they're not anymore slaves to their master. So the slavery, the ownership, the possession of the master is nifka. That's over. But at the same time, they're not yet bnei chayren. They're not free to go home. Then the positive aspect of them attaining their own level of freedom and being a ben chayren, that's when they can go home. And this is the Rambam Mechadish, and this is what the Rambam is explaining and is telling us the novelty about the mitzvah on the night of Pesach, as Geshem wie bei Schiris Shabbos. Is ikra nit as de inyan shlili shaba hadra malacha, just like when it comes to the mitzvah of remembering Shabbos. So what's the primary focus? Not so much the negative, the lack or the refraining from work. It's the positive aspect, that it's a day of rest. Al derech says the chiyuv sippe b'yitzias Mitzrayim nit azay in the shlila, the mitzvah here of telling the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim on the night of Pesach, different than a whole year, is that over here the focus is not on the negative, that we left the avdos, the slavery of Mitzrayim, the Yitziv Bnei Yisrael and avdos reshus paray, nor beikir in the inyan chiyuvi zeiverim bnei chayrim. But rather the main thing you should focus on is the positive aspect, that Yidden were elevated to the status of being free people. That's the main focus, similar to the way it is in the pasuk of Zocher es Yom HaShabbos. Now, based on this, we can understand how this is an introduction to the points that the Rambam says in the halachas following regarding the content of the mitzvah of telling the story in the night of Pesach. Und wie der Rambam ist das Madgish gleich in der zweite halacha, as we see this highlighted clearly in the words in the Rambam in the second halacha. As afile in dem sippe b'yitzias Mitzrayim in meifen achim nomuchu pashet. Even when the Rambam describes how one should tell the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim in the most simple and basic manner. When you say the story to a child or to a simple person, is b'shas as oimerloi b'ni kulanu ayina avadim k'may shivcha zeh or k'may evet zeh b'mitzrayim. You say to him, my son, we were all slaves, we were all maidservants, like you see this slave here, and Oikemoi Eved Zeh b'Mitzrayim, like a shifcha or like an Eved that was in Mitzrayim. That's how the Rambam begins to describe how one should relate the story to a child. Vierte Reis, but then the Rambam concludes, nit bekitzer. The Rambam doesn't say it shortly and simply and concisely, wie es wird gepasst mehr l'chayre, in dem Amire zu hakotten typisch, as it would be fitting if the Rambam is describing what it is that you should say to a child or a simple person that you can't say too much, but just very basic. As balayla is hazeh yitzanu misham, chayetze bezeh. So you just say very simply that it's on this night that we left Mitzrayim, or something similar. No, rather the Rambam here says, "Ubalayla zeh podoi sanu HaKadosh Baruch Hu vayetzienu l'cheirus." It's on this night that Hashem has redeemed us, and He took us out into freedom. So why is the Rambam adding these words here? Was is mefar? Madgish just clarifies and highlights. Nit nor di yitziyim Mitzrayim. Podoi sanu. It's not only the fact that it's on this day that we were redeemed from Mitzrayim. Not as der Eibishter hat uns gemacht b'nei chayren. Rather that the Eibishter is the one with his great wonders and miracles that turned us into free people. Not only the lack of being or not being under the jurisdiction of Mitzrayim, but we are attained our own level of freedom. That's what you have to say in the story, even when you're speaking to a child, to explain him what happened in this night of Pesach. Und davon kommt der Reis, wie der Rambam is mamshech. And this also explains what the Rambam says later on. As chayiv adam laharis esatzmai, a person has to demonstrate ki'ilu hu ba'atzmai yotza ato mishivud Mitzrayim, as if he himself today has left Mitzrayim. And an eifin as ki'ilu ato ba'atzmacha yisa eved v'yitzas l'chayres v'niftis, as if you yourself were a slave and you went out of Mitzrayim, you went into freedom and you were redeemed. Mizgevarim b'nei chayren. What the Rambam here is highlighting is the fact that v'yatzas l'chayres, that we went out to a level of freedom. And therefore tonight, when we're going to eat the meal, meisev derech chayres, one has to recline like one that is a free man. The anhaga von Laila zeh dav zayin via ben chayren. Our behavior this night has to be like a person that's a free man. Derech chayres, the way of a free person that reclines comfortably. So here the point is not only the fact that we don't have that level of slavery, but that we got elevated to a different status of being a free man that sits comfortably and reclines. That's what's being expressed in our behavior this night. And in the story, the way Yetzias Mitzrayim is related on this night, different than the rest of the year. Now, based on this, we can understand another detail also, which we can see in the Medrash. That's the source of where the Rambam sees this comparison. This point here as well that was explained, the Rambam sees it in the Medrash. Von Siyum Lashon HaMedrash, Zocher esayem ezeshi yitzasem Mitzrayim. Remember this day, you went out of Mitzrayim, and the Medrash goes on to say, Lama ki b'choizik yad hitziach Hashem Mitzrayim. Why? Because Hashem, with His great mighty hand, took you out of Mitzrayim. So the Medrash concludes specifically with this point of choizik yad, the mighty hand of Hashem. Das was wird gedarft ankommen zum choizik yad, a pe'ule meyechedes von Eibishten. The fact that we need the mighty hand of Hashem, and these are the great miracles and wonders when by Yetzias Mitzrayim, when Yidden left Mitzrayim, is nit azay to leave the shlila. That's not necessary so much for the negative, meaning to take Yidden out of the slavery of Mitzrayim. That a raise gain for Shibud Mitzrayim. Warum die Gzeire is doch l'chatchila gewen va'avodim v'inu ha'isam abba mei shana. The decree on Yidden was, from the beginning, it was a set time that they're going to be there for 400 years. Gleich wie es hat sich geendigt, wie abba mei shana. And as soon as the 400 years are over, haben die Yidden b'derech memele gedacht a reis gain from Shibud Mitzrayim. So then automatically, the Yidden would leave the subjugation of Mitzrayim. No, it's leave that in Yechiyuvi. However, for the positive aspect here, to machen Yidden, for b'nei chayren, to create something new here, that Yidden are elevated to a different status of people, that they become free people. And an oisgetelte Volk, b'nei chayren, a nation for themselves that are different than everybody else, that they are a free people regardless of whatever condition they are in. They're elevated to being, in essence, on this status of free people. That's a new creation. That's a chayzik yad, something that Hashem has accomplished with the great miracles and wonders. Kolzman is a folk, was das is lo'ilam. As long as Yidden are a nation, which is forever, am oilam, is men b'nei chayren. Yidden, no matter what condition they are in, even when Yidden are again externally in exile, but they are still in essence a free people. So to elevate Yidden to this status, to become a free people forever, that's the chayzik yad, that's the accomplishment of Yetzias Mitzrayim in the positive level. Und wie der Rambam ist das Madgish in Emshech HaPerek. And as we see, as the Rambam explains this in the continuation of the Perek, as das was tzarich l'sayim b'shvach, when you say the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, and you begin with the Gnai, you begin how Yidden were enslaved in Mitzrayim, and then you conclude with the praise that Hashem took us out, is das was Mitzrayim b'das ha'emes, shekevanu ha'mokim loi, vivdilanu min ha'umais, v'kevanu li'yichudai, that Hashem gave us the religion of truth, and He brought us close to Him, and He separated us from all nations and brought us close to His oneness. And we speak about the great miracles and wonders that Hashem performed for us in our freedom. So we see here in the emphasis of the Rambam that this is the main point that we're highlighting in the story tonight in the Leil HaSeder in Pesach, not just the fact that we are not suffering and that we're not anymore subjugated to Parai, but the fact that Yidden became a new entity, a nation which is a Ben Chayrin, which is always free people, and that's only through the great miracles and wonders of Hashem that He separates and elevates Yidden to this level. This is the explanation of the Rambam and the comparison to the mitzvah of Shabbos. Now, Shengeret Filmal, it was already explained many times, as B'shas melernt up en yinyin von atzveiten. When you learn one subject from another, Chachas l'chayre is their limud b'loy zaraya for us, even though what we're learning out from is just as a proof for what we're interested here. B'chtei mir sollen wissen that Inyan darf mir uplernen von zweiten Inyan. In order that we should have a proof for this information here, so we're just learning it from somewhere else. But so the source that we're learning it from is not really in essence relevant here. It's what we're trying to figure out in the meaning here. That's on a simple level. However, mitzat shleimus haTorah, because of the completeness of Torah. And therefore everything in Torah is exact. So therefore we must say that on a deeper level, as the Inyan HaMalamed, the subject from where we're learning out from, it's not only about setting and establishing the idea that we're looking for in the subject that we're studying now, the source that we're learning it from is actually the reason or the cause for what we're learning out from there to the subject that we're learning in here now. Or at least the source that we're learning it out from is how we bring it out or how we reveal the source of this idea that applies here. So it's not just a random comparison, but it's actually related to the subject that we're learning here. So Benidin Didan, in our case, when it comes to the comparison of Yetzias Mitzrayim to Shabbos, Zetman das Baifim Goli. We could see this very clearly. It's known as in Divrei Rambam B'Sfarav Zenadon Yonah from Pnimiyus HaTorah that in the words of the Rambam in his Sfarim, we see subjects of the deeper aspect of Torah. Says however, they're not always revealed, nor behalten to b'derech remez. It's hidden and it's in a hint. So over here as well, if we look here in this comparison of Yetzias Mitzrayim to Shabbos, there's something deeper that's being hinted here in the comparison. So here, based on what we spoke about before regarding the rest of Shabbos on a deeper level, let's look at what it says in Pnimiyus HaTorah and Chassidus regarding the rest of Shabbos. It says, Mevor and Chassidus, as die zwei in Yonim Anal and Shabbos. It's explained in Chassidus regarding the two subjects mentioned before regarding the rest of Shabbos. One, the Shvise from Malache, ki voi Shabbos mekom malachtei. The rest, when one is resting, when he's refraining from work. On the Shvisu menucha chiyuvis. And then the positive aspect of rest, vayonach vayom hashvi, that it's a day of rest. Not only because of the refraining from work, but just designated for itself as a day of rest. Zanetzvei madreges and Shabbos. These are actually two levels in Shabbos itself. Shabbos the Laila, there is the night of Shabbos, so bestu the Shabbos Harishayna, the first meal of Shabbos, on Shabbos the Yaima, and then Shabbos morning, Shabbos day, Suda Shniya, the second meal of Shabbos. So what's the explanation that Chassidus says for this? Klolos and Yonaf and Shabbos is v'karasa l'Shabbos Einik. Generally, the day of Shabbos is a day of pleasure. The Rinyan Einik, on the Tainig sind da zwei Madreges. When it comes to the level of pleasure that's revealed on this day of Shabbos, this is revealed on two stages and two levels. The Tainig von dem, was that is Shevis Mimalachtai, there's a level of pleasure that is revealed on Shabbos that's a result of refraining from work, or the fact that you can stop, you can rest from your work. The Hainu, Vida says, Bedugme by the Madam Lamata, just like this is by a person below, as seine Keiches, welche seine Nimshach, wenn es zamtzim, in der Asiya on Melache, that the work, when a person works, so that he's not in himself, he's not to himself and in himself, he's active and involved in something else, and therefore he has to very much focus on what he's doing in the work, and he can't be restful in himself. So then when one stops this work, so now he can go back to himself. And here, the pleasure, which pleasure is the essence of who the person is, to himself, that's revealed now. That's what the refraining or resting from work represents. That's one level of Tainug. Aber der Tainug is noch verbunden mit Melacha. This level of pleasure is still a pleasure related to and connected to the work that he's stopping. Kommt zu sich von sein Haravanya. When a person is working so hard, then he can finally breathe, and he can take in the pleasure of himself, to be with himself. Verbunden mit der Schwiese von der Asiya Pratis. And it's also not the essence of pleasure as it is itself, but it's a pleasure that the person experiences in relation to this condition of where there was the strenuous activity, or whatever it is that he was doing. That's one level of rest. And this relates to the level of the Tainug of Hashem that's revealed on Shabbos, when Hashem creates the world, and this represents Hashem coming down, a Yerida and a Tzimtzum in creating the world. And then on the day of Shabbos, when Hashem rests, this is revealing a deeper level of Tainug of Hashem in the world when he stops from the work and the Tzimtzum that was involved in creating the world. A higher level in this is that Tainug was verbunden mit Menucha be'etzem, is the pleasure that comes from when one is in a restful place in essence, not in relation to something, not coming back to himself from work. Was kommt nach der Tainug mishvisem melacha, which follows after one experiences the Tainug, the pleasure. When he can stop his work, then you come to really be in touch with the essence of yourself, where the true pleasure of the person is expressed and revealed. This reveals the essence of the pleasure itself, was es hecher von haben hashayches mit die prote ha'asiyah von the malacha, that's removed and completely unrelated to the specific work that the person was doing, that he now has pleasure, that he can stop from that work. On malacha b'chlal, or it's not related to any work at all. So too, the higher level of Shabbos is the level of Hashem, of godliness, that's revealed in the world on Shabbos, that's above and removed completely from the 6 days of creation. These two levels are the two expressions of Zachar and Shomer that it says in the Aseres HaDibris in Parshas Yisrael and in Parshas Va'aschanan, to remember Shabbos and to keep Shabbos. Shomer, as it says in Kabbalah and in Chassidus, Shomer is lenukve. Shomer is feminine, because das is shaykh to Shabbos the Laila. This is related to the night of Shabbos, when one is taking in Shabbos and he's stopping from the work that he did right before in the 6 days of creation. Ubechlalos, now generally speaking, be'elokos is das die madrege von Oyer HaMemalech Alamen. In the level of godliness that's revealed here, in this level of rest, it's the level of Oyer HaMemalech Alamen, was hat a shayches zur Welt. The level of godliness that's related to the existence of the world. In the 6 days of creation, this revelation comes down and it's minimized according to the existence of the world. And then on the night of Shabbos, by the Shvisim Melacha, when there's a stop to this work and to this coming down into the world, is Batla Lavush, is Meir Begilui. So then the source of this level of Memalech Alamin, of this level of godliness, can be revealed on Shabbos. That's the first level of pleasure, of the godly pleasure in the world that's revealed. The term of Zachar refers to the male aspect of Shabbos, the madrege von Yoime de Shabbata. This is the morning of Shabbos. Der Gili von Eira Soiviv Kolalmen. This is the revelation of Soiviv Kolalmen. A level of godliness was his hecher von his chalkos and his slapshus in the Asiya Malacha, Menucha Be'etzem. This is a godly level which is Soiviv Kolalmen, that refers to a level of godliness where all levels are one and the same. It's a level that's not related to the limitations and divisions that exist in the world, and therefore here, when this level is revealed, this is the true source of rest, where it's an essence removed of any relation of any other work or anything mundane in the world. Those are the two levels of Shabbos. That's why in the Nusach of Davening, the night of Shabbos, which is related to feminine, Lenukva, we say V'yinuchu Va, a feminine expression, and on the day of Shabbos we say V'yinuchu Vai, the masculine expression. Und die Rebbe gefindt man von alle Yomim Tovim wird befehrisch nur Pesach angerufen Shabbos. And now therefore we find, since Pesach is compared, it also has these two levels and two aspects about Yidden leaving Mitzrayim. So what we find explicitly in the Torah, a yontif that has the name Shabbos, we find it regarding Pesach. Weil die Nissen, wenn Flois, schon Meile Ma'ateva Legamri, bei der Gula von Mitzrayim, sind verbunden mit der Hecher Madrega von Shabbos. It's because by Pesach we find not only a level of a yontif which is related to the lower concept of Shabbos, leaving, or here regarding Mitzrayim, leaving the subjugation and the slavery of Parai, but also the higher aspect that Yidden are elevated above nature altogether, above the limitations of the world, and they become B'nai Chayrin, free people, free from any of the limitations of the existence of the world. And das is Mavor Rambam, and this is what's explained there in the Rambam as der Lesaper B'Nissim V'Nefloi Shenasa Lavisena B'Mitzrayim Shenemar Zachar Esem Hazeh is K'moi Shenemar Zachar Esem HaShabbos. The main thing that the Rambam highlights about saying the story in the night of Pesach is to focus on the miracles and wonders that Hashem performed when we left Mitzrayim. That's similar to Shabbos. So V'hainu, what this means is as follows: as der Inyi Chiyuvi from the Lesaper B'Nissim V'Nefloi is the Yitzias Mitzrayim, that this positive aspect of speaking about the wonders and miracles when Yidden were taken out of Mitzrayim, nennt sich von Zachar Esem HaShabbos. It's not only just simply learned out from there to clarify Pshat here, but actually the source of this is, where it comes from is from the mitzvah of Shabbos. Von dem Inyan Chiyuvi von Shabbos Menucha Mitzad Atzmai. From the higher and positive aspect of Shabbos, where it's the essence of the pleasure of Hashem, the level of Seivav Kalam that's revealed in Shabbos. Von Zayniga Madrege, being that this is a level, was is legamri hecha from Welt, that's totally removed of the limitations of the world, kommt sie herab in Welt beifen von Nesopella. So therefore the way this is expressed and revealed in the world is not in the order of nature of the world, but by a miracle and a wonder, something that is nit nissim amalabashim in teva, and even within miracles itself, not a miracle that gets integrated into nature in one way or another. That's the source of the comparison to Shabbos. Is not just a comparison. The source of this level comes from the higher level of Shabbos. And it's because Yitzias Mitzrayim was from such a level, this is the reason why Yidden experienced the ultimate level of freedom, and an Eifen as von Demel don kennen sie shemen et sein ken avodim. They cannot anymore ever return to any aspect or any level of slavery because they're completely removed from the limitation of the world. Weil the Geula nimmt sich vom Beginnes Shabbos. The redemption came from this level of Shabbos, Alme de Cheru, a world and a reality of absolute freedom. Und mit Zadem sind Yidden aufgehoben geworden, Heche von den Mitzarim und Gvulim von Seder Stalschluss. Leaving Mitzrayim ultimately means to leave any restrictions that is, or any limitations of any level of existence in the entire system of creation. And the full completion of this, V'zayin Begula Sida B'Kodev Mamish, will be in the upcoming redemption very soon. V'zayin Acheres U'Geula Amitis U'Shleimus Begoloi, then will be a true and real freedom and redemption, and a complete redemption. U'Noich Nisim V'Neflois Begoloi, and miracles and wonders in a revealed manner. Kimei Tzeischa Meretz Mitzrayim, Maren and the flies, like the days that you've been taken out of Mitzrayim. Hashem will show us wonders again. Ubemyuchad b'yayim shekulei Shabbos umenucha l'chayei lamim. And especially coming to the time period after Mashiach comes, where the pasuk describes it'll be a day where it'll be all day, always Shabbos and rest forever and ever.